Welcome to Shadow Fable. Don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy slow-burning psychological horror stories made to lull you into unease. Tonight's tale is called The Forgotten Melody. It begins with a woman who hasn't touched a piano in 20 years, until she hears a melody that no one else can. She's the only one who hears it. And she's not sure if it's saving her or pulling her away. The sound came again at dusk, faint, like the memory of a song. Margot Hale sat upright in the high-backed armchair, one hand frozen mid-stitch above the fabric of a half-finished quilt. Her ears strained. It was there, a fragile piano melody drifting through the wide hallway of the Autumn Pines care residence. Not the kind of jingle you'd hear piped from a visitor's phone or a music therapy session. This was delicate, deliberate, and familiar. But when she asked the night nurse, the young one with the drawn-on eyebrows, the girl just smiled and said, "There's no piano on this floor, Miss Hale. Maybe one of the others has their TV on again." Margot didn't argue. She'd learned not to. They always smiled like that here, like she was glassware that might crack if handled wrong. Still, that night she sat up in bed longer than usual. Listening? It came again the next evening. Louder this time and closer. A series of carefully placed notes, minor chords, faint arpeggios, something like a lullaby, but not quite. It wasn't tuneful. It lingered oddly at the end of each phrase, like the pianist was waiting for her to recognize it. She hadn't played in years, not since she'd walked away from it all. Margot hadn't always been here, of course. She had once been Margot Hale, the concert pianist, trained in Vienna, praised in Chicago, reviewed in the Times as a rare fusion of technical mastery and ghost-like intuition. She'd given all that up when her sister Elaine died in the fire. That was decades ago now, long enough that even the guilt had yellowed around the edges. But something about the melody clawed at that locked door. By the third night, she couldn't ignore it anymore. The halls were quiet past 10. That's when she slipped out, wearing her slippers and that long navy robe that always made her feel like someone's forgotten aunt. She pressed her hand to the wall and walked slowly, feeling each step in her joints. The melody led her, down the corridor, past the framed oil prints of birds and boats, toward the east wing they rarely used. The lights dimmed there at night. It was a part of the building still being evaluated for renovation, the staff said. A place meant to be off-limits. But someone had left the door slightly ajar. The music was clearer now. A soft, slow waltz. Not one she remembered by name, but her hands tingled as if they'd once played it. Inside was a rec room, abandoned and musty. Dust hung like smoke in the low light from an emergency bulb. And there, in the center, sat an old upright piano. Its surface was dulled with age. Several of its keys were yellowing. But the lid was open, the bench was pulled back, and no one was there. Yet the music continued, faint but steady, notes pressed one by one as though moved by unseen fingers. Margot froze. Her breath caught in her chest. It wasn't fear, not exactly, more like recognition. Then, just as she stepped closer, the music stopped. Silence bloomed around her, thick and waiting. She didn't tell anyone. Who would she tell? The nurse who kept calling her "dearie," Dr. Latimer with his soothing voice and clipboard smiles. Number. She returned to her room, closed the door, and didn't sleep. Instead, she stared at the ceiling and felt something strange, like a thread being pulled loose inside her. The next morning, Margot asked to speak with the director. She asked if they still offered music therapy. "Twice a week," the woman said. "You're always welcome." "I mean, real music," Margot replied. "Practice, performance, a piano that listens." The director blinked. "Well, we do have one in storage. The East Wing, actually. Not used in years, but if you're up for it, we could have it tuned." "No need," Margot said. "It's already playing." She didn't wait for the puzzled look. She was already walking away. She visited the piano again that evening. This time, no melody led her. The room was cold, darker than before, but the piano sat just as she'd left it, waiting. Her fingers hovered over the keys, tentative, disbelieving. Then, almost in reflex, they pressed. A single note, then another. The keys were stiff, the action clunky, but the sound it made, oh, how it echoed. Not in the room, but in her mind, like something deep had stirred awake. She played softly, slowly. Each note unlocked something. A shape, a color, a phrase. Then, suddenly, without thinking, she played the melody. The melody, the one she'd been hearing. The one that had led her here. It flowed from her hands like it had been waiting in her bones all this time. When she finished, she turned and found the room wasn't empty. A woman stood in the corner, pale, narrow-shouldered, in a dark gray coat. Eyes too dark to reflect the light. Watching. Margot opened her mouth to speak. The woman blinked once, then vanished. She didn't tell anyone about that either. Over the next week, she returned each night. Each time, she played a little more. Pieces she hadn't touched in years. Some she barely remembered learning, but her fingers knew them. The piano welcomed them. And each time, the woman in the gray coat returned. Closer now. Always silent. Always watching. And Margot felt no fear. Only a strange comfort, like she was finally being seen. But she began to forget other things. Her morning walks, her meal times, her roommate's name. One night, she found herself in the music room without recalling how she'd gotten there. Another time, she woke in bed with dust on her fingertips and no memory of playing. Dr. Latimer noted her confusion, suggested a new medication, something to help the mind rest. She didn't take it because she wasn't confused. Not really. Something was returning to her. Something more important than names or dates or the dull routines of a retirement home. She was beginning to remember the fire. Elaine had been a gifted musician too, but never pursued it. She stayed home, took care of their mother, the house, the little things. Margot went to Vienna. Margot went to Carnegie. Margot got the spotlight. Elaine got the creaky old family home, and then the fire, late November. A forgotten kettle, they said, smoke in the attic. She hadn't made it out. But Margot remembered something else now. They'd argued, bitterly, over the piano. Elaine had accused her of abandoning the only thing that mattered to them both. Margot had shouted, words meant to wound. She'd slammed the front door and driven back to the city. When the call came the next morning, the house was already ash. And so she stopped playing for 20 years. Now, when she played the melody, the true melody, she remembered Elaine. She remembered her voice, her laughter, her music, and every time she saw the woman in gray, she began to recognize her. Elaine? But Elaine didn't smile. And one night, Margot asked, "Is this what you wanted? To haunt me?" Elaine's eyes were not cruel, but neither were they kind. She raised one hand, pointed toward the piano, then turned and walked through the wall. Margot sat there a long time, the melody still faintly echoing behind her ribs. She didn't sleep that night, or the next. There was a pull now, a sense that each note was drawing something from her, not just memory, but presence, some essential piece of herself. The staff noticed. Her hands trembled more. She drifted in conversation. Dr. Latimer wrote, "Increased cognitive decline" in her file. But Margot felt clearer than she had in years. She began to write the melody down during the day, on the back of menus, paper napkins, whatever she could find. But every time she tried to complete it, the notes slipped away, like trying to trace breath on glass. Until one night the woman in gray finally spoke. Margot was mid-phrase, her fingers playing almost by instinct now. The melody had taken on a life of its own. That strange, minor rhythm that looped like a question never fully asked. And from behind her, a whisper, barely audible, cut through the chords. "You're almost finished." Margot turned. The room was empty, but the mirror above the unused fireplace showed a reflection. 2 women at the piano. She dropped her hands. Elaine stood beside her, paler now, more defined. Her face, older, as if she had aged in parallel all these years. "Why?" Margot whispered. The reflection smiled, but Elaine, real or not, did not. "You never finished it," she said. "Not then. Not before the fire." Margot's breath hitched. "It was ours. I wasn't ready." "No," came the reply. "You were ashamed." Margot looked down. Her fingers twitched against the keys. The final notes hovered in her mind, like birds afraid to land. "If I finish it now," she began. Elaine stepped closer, and this time it wasn't the reflection. "If you finish it now," she said softly, "you'll remember everything. And then you can choose." That night, the melody changed. It expanded, reaching beyond its former limits. It deepened, flourished, minor chords blooming into aching dissonance, then resolving into something almost mournful. Margot wept as she played. Not from fear or sorrow, from recognition. This was their piece. Hers and Elaine's. The one they'd started writing as girls on their grandmother's upright. The one they'd never finished. She had abandoned it after the fire. After she'd buried her sister with no eulogy, no tribute, no song. Until now. As the final note hung in the air, trembling into silence, she closed her eyes and remembered. It wasn't the kettle, it was the argument. Elaine had packed a bag, said she was leaving. "You only come back here to practice," she'd said. "This house isn't your home anymore. I'm not your family." They shouted. Margot had stormed out. But then, on the porch, she'd turned back and seen the lamp, fallen, cracked, sparks near the drapes. She had hesitated, one breath, then another. She had left. She hadn't called the fire department. She told herself she hadn't seen it, told herself it wasn't real. But now she remembered it all. Back in the present, the room was dark, the melody complete, and Margot felt hollowed out, lighter somehow. Elaine stood beside her. No longer a ghost, not angry, not sad, just waiting. "Do I follow you?" Margot asked. Elaine didn't answer, only held out her hand. Margot looked down at her own, spotted, wrinkled, trembling slightly in the still air. She did not take it, not yet. Instead, she turned back to the piano and began to play again. A new melody, one that had never existed before, one filled with memory, but also something else. Forgiveness. As she played, Elaine's figure softened, shimmered, and faded. No vanishing act, no drama, just a final note held in perfect stillness. The next morning, the staff found Margot asleep at the piano. The director made a note in her chart. Patient wandered again, appears confused. But Margot wasn't confused, not anymore. She never spoke of the melody again, never saw Elaine, but every week she returned to the piano, played for an empty room, and every time she finished, she left the bench a little taller, a little steadier, as if something once fractured inside her had been delicately mended, not erased, not forgotten, but whole.